Hey folks, in this video we're talking about lab reports. What separates a good lab report from a bad lab report? Here's the general rubric I'm using. Might get modified in the future, but you can see that we have 4 different tiers of success or quality of lab report and 4 different categories that are going to be assessed. So we're looking at the introduction, the procedure or method section, and the analysis. And then format plays a role in here too. So let's go through these one by one, and then we'll look at some examples of not so great work and great work. So the introduction, basically, at the very least, this should introduce the purpose of the experiment. Ideally, you want to be introducing the purpose of the experiment, talking about what chemistry takes place, what equipment is used, and what techniques will be used. And really, if you want to do a great job, you should provide some additional background information about the topic studied. That can be all sorts of stuff. Whatever you find interesting about the topic really can go in there. And it's a fun way to also practice doing research because you can research stuff that you're interested in. The procedure should be a description of what you actually did, what procedure you did. And in your procedure, you should include observations that you made during the experiment. This will include both qualitative and quantitative observations. And you should be including units with those. And you should be making observations generally throughout the entire experiment. Some experiments, you're just going to be collecting numeric data, so you mostly will have quantitative data. Other experiments will mostly have qualitative data, but in general, you want to get both. And so if you really want to do a good job, you should have a nice detailed description of the procedure. Yep, cool. The analysis section is really the most important, meatiest bit of this. So in the analysis section, you're going to want to discuss that data that you mentioned up here. What does it mean? And you won't necessarily, hey, Belle, shush. You won't necessarily discuss all of that data because some observations you might not be super important. But it's better to have more observations in your procedure and not talk about all of them in your analysis section. Your analysis section will usually have some discussion of precision and accuracy. So usually you're going to have some sort of data and you can compare it to an accepted value. And if you have a set of data, you can say whether or not it is precise. Any calculations, particularly complicated ones, should be shown in the analysis section. And really, you should have some sort of answer for the lab. Generally, we have a question in the lab that we're seeking to answer, and you should have some sort of answer in your analysis section. And the last thing to look at is format. So format, you want to have any figures or tables that you're using labeled. You want to have a generally professional format and layout. You want to label each one of these sections so that people know they're reading the introduction or the procedure or the analysis. And you want to have citations for any references you use, and you also want to use third-person scientific writing. So that means no I, me, we, just talking like a cold robot who doesn't have a sense of self. So let's look at this not-so-great lab report. Here we've got a method section, an introduction, and we do state the purpose of the lab, measuring density of aluminum, and how it's done is mentioned. But we don't really have much information up here, just a general definition of density and stating that there are graphs made. So this isn't super great. And the other thing is there's a lot of we being used. We did this, we did that. So not super awesome. And then it just jumps right into the procedure or method section. There's no way to know this because there's no breaking these up. But here we just have a very general description. We got the volume with the ruler and displacement. So that's not a very accurate description. If I were reading this, I might not know exactly how a person did their procedure. And you should know exactly how a experiment was carried out by reading this procedure section. We've got some data here, but there's no label on these tables, so I'm not really sure what they're from. I could infer that this is from displacement based on the tables, but somebody should tell me. And I think this is the analysis. We made graphs with the data and got the slope. It was close to the real density of aluminum. The density from the ruler was more accurate. Okay, so they do have an answer to the experiment. We can say, hey, we were able to get a better density from using a ruler to calculate volume. But there's no comparison of any of the actual data up here other than saying it was close. And I hate that. I want to see numbers. So this is a not very good lab report. Let's look at a much better one. So here, this one already looks way more crisp. I've got my name up top and a header with the page number. I have a title for the lab, and my introduction starts right here. I'm not going to read through this whole thing, but this whole paragraph is just basically background information on density. And I have 3 citations in here. And if you want to see, I've used the footnotes. I didn't do proper citations in MLA format, which I'm not expecting in every lab report. But I have the title of the article I used and also the website that I found it from. And you'll notice that these are all at .edu websites. I made sure that I picked my site sources from reputable educational websites. And the way I actually found this information was I just Googled density, and I went to my good friend Wikipedia, and from there I didn't find any useful citations, but I found information. And generally Wikipedia is a good starting point. So in my first paragraph, I talk about the buoyancy. Density is relative to buoyancy. Well, I read this, and then I just Googled density and buoyancy, and I found a .edu page that talked about it. I also read that it can be affected by temperature and pressure, and so I Googled how that affects it, and I found the .edu website talking about it. I also saw they talk somewhere in here about purity, I think. Yeah, they talk about purity, and I was curious about that. So I Googled that, and I also found a reputable website. So Wikipedia is a great place to find initial information, but I didn't cite Wikipedia because it's not super trusted, but it's a great place to get started in your search. And then so here I thoroughly discussed how the aluminum, or what rather was done in the experiment, the different techniques that were used and the different pieces of equipment that were used, and also the goal. The accuracy of density produced by the 2 methods was analyzed, and the efficiency of efficacy, rather, of each method was assessed. So my method section, it starts here, and that's a lot more clear. I go through much more precisely what was done, where the information can be found from each one of the methods, and how each method was carried out. And so those data, the data from that is in these tables, and these tables have nice titles on them, so oh, this table goes with the ruler. And when I talk about using the ruler, I say, hey, the results are summarized in table 1. So as you read this, you know that you will look here for the information about the ruler. And if you are a lazy reader, you can just read the title. So very nice. So we've got my data, and then we jump into my analysis section. So I start with just analyzing the raw data. So I just looked at the densities produced from each graph, and I commented on their accuracy and precision compared to the accepted value for the density of aluminum. That's pretty quick. And then I talked about using the densities to make those line of best fit graphs, which are below, and I call them figures 1 and 2. And below I have them labeled as figure 1 and figure 2. And I talk a little bit about the slopes, and I comment on the percent error and decide that the density, or the density from the ruler was more accurate. So I have a final answer to my experiment. And I make sure that when I talk about the data, I actually reference the numbers. So I've made sure that I typed these numbers in to my analysis section. I don't want to just say, hey, one is bigger than the other without actually showing the numbers. So that's what a good lab report and a not so good lab report looks like, at least for me. I hope this video was informational. I hope you feel better about writing a lab report, at least for me. And I hope you have a great rest of your life.